and welcome back to Button. We have a third guinea pig book that we need to read with you. I have done a guinea pig nativity and a guinea pig Romeo and Juliet, and those I will link up here and down in the description box in case you have missed those, because Button really enjoyed doing those. She wanted to be back on the channel and she reminded me that we had not read a Guinea Pig Pride and Prejudice yet, so today we have a Guinea Pig Pride and Prejudice. Yes? Are you very excited? I think that this is probably Elizabeth Bennet on the front, but let's find out, shall we? So we have a Guinea Pig Pride and Prejudice, a novel, and here is the cast of characters. We have obviously Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, then Mr. Wickham, Mr. Bingley, Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine, Lydia, Jane, and Mr. Bennet. Can you see them all there? Yes. Volume 1, Netherfield Park. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Netherfield Park had been taken by a certain Mr. Bingley, a single man of a large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. I think Mr. Bingley looks very distinguished, don't you? You're just tired, are you? Okay. Gosh, the writing is small. Mrs. Bennet, who had 5 unmarried daughters, was greatly excited by the arrival of Mr. Bingley in the neighbourhood. By all accounts, he was a young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next ball. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. It is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them. But at the ball was his friend Mr. Darcy, who soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person. Handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year and a large estate in Derbyshire. Mr. Bingley was good looking, but Mr. Darcy was much handsomer, a fine figure of a man. Can you see Mr. Darcy? Mr. Darcy was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till he slighted Elizabeth Bennet by refusing to dance with her. Can you imagine? He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. But as their acquaintance grew over time, Mr. Darcy began to find that Elizabeth's face was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. In fact, Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. She's beautiful, isn't she, Button? Perhaps not as beautiful as you. What painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? I know. Yet, despite his burgeoning affection, Darcy soon found himself quarrelling with Elizabeth. "Your defect," said Elizabeth, "is propensity to hate everybody." "And yours," he replied with a smile, "is wilfully to misunderstand them." Elizabeth found him proud and haughty, and Darcy wisely resolved that he would not even look at her. By tea time, however, it was clear that Mr. Bingley and Jane Bennet were in love. Bingley was full of joy and attention for Jane. He talked scarcely to anyone else. Can you see them, Button? Can you see them talking? Yes. I know. It's very romantic. Some days later, the Bennets set off off on a walk to Merton with Mr. Collins, a visiting cousin who was eager to improve his acquaintance with Elizabeth. "I am happy on every occasion," Mr. Collins told Elizabeth, "to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies." Oh, I know. You've seen the BBC adaptation, haven't you, Button? You've seen it. They were introduced to Mr. Wickham. I know, Mr. Wickham. Can you see him in his soldier's outfit? Scandalous. Who had come from town to accept a commission in the cause. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and happy readiness of conversation. All were struck with the stranger's air and wondered who he could be. Well, we know it's Mr. Wickham. Oh. The party was increased by the unexpected arrival of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Darcy was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of Wickham. Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both men as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colours. One looked white, the other red. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not long to know. I think Button's falling asleep. She's obviously enjoying the story time. When they chanced to be alone together, Mr. Wickham told Elizabeth of the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. "We played together as children," he said. "Mr. Darcy's father was my godfather, and bequeathed me the best living in his will. But when the living fell, Darcy gave it elsewhere." Wickham shook his head. Darcy was jealous of his father's uncommon attachment to me. Pride had often been his best friend. The fact is that we are very different sort of men, and he hates me. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements. Do you like their little collars? Do you like them? Yes. Elizabeth honoured Wickham for his noble refusal to expose Darcy's villainy to the world, and thought him handsomer than ever. "Mr. Wickham is the most agreeable man I ever saw," she thought. "How am I to know that it would be wisdom to resist?" But before she could think of marrying Wickham, Mr. Collins surprised her with a proposal of marriage. Nothing remains but for me to reassure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Mr. Collins was refused, though with no little difficulty, but he soon recovered and married Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte, who was not at all romantic and only asked for a comfortable home. Miss Bennet, however, was less phlegmatic. "Miss Lizzie, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all." And now we're on to Volume 2, The Parsonage. Volume 2, Button. Very exciting. But it was quickly forgiven, and Elizabeth soon visited the new Mr. and Mrs. Collins at the parsonage home in Kent, where they entertained Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Are you ready to see Lady Catherine de Bourgh? Button's very excited. Lady Catherine's manner of receiving them was not such as to make her visitors forget their inferior rank. The party did not supply much conversation. Do you like her hat? Oh, I know. Next page. Their visit passed pleasantly enough until one day Elizabeth was suddenly roused by the sound of the doorbell, and to her utter amazement it was Mr. Darcy. He walked into the room and asked for her hand in marriage. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression, but Darcy's pride was still overbearing. He spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but he was sure of being accepted. He lingered on the inferiority of her family. In short, he behaved in a most ungentlemanlike manner. And how could she marry a man who had treated Mr. Wickham so infamously? So she declined his offer. I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed upon to marry. It's a bit harsh, isn't it? What do you think? Yes. But then Mr. Darcy wrote her a long letter relating the truth about Mr. Wickham's wanton prolificancy and his elopement with 15-year-old Georgiana Darcy, Mr. Darcy's own sister, which Darcy had only thwarted at the very last moment. A gamester. Can you see him? I know, that's Mr. Wickham. Shocking. The letter had quite an effect on Elizabeth Bennet's opinion of Mr. Darcy. How despicably have I acted, Elizabeth cried. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. Till this moment, I never knew myself. That's her letter there. A little bit of guinea pig on that page. She looks a little bit like you from above. It's true. It's so true. And now on to Pemberley. Oh, this is the cover photo, look. Elizabeth returned home to Hertfordshire. Her spirits were sadly affected, and all sense of pleasure was lost in shame, until her uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, invited her to join them in their northern tour. She joyfully accepted. The party arrived in Derbyshire, and as Mr. Darcy was away in town, Miss Gardiner decided that they should visit his estate at Pemberley. Walking around the beautiful grounds and admiring the delightful aspects, Elizabeth everywhere saw Darcy's restrained yet elegant taste. At that moment she felt that to be the mistress of Pemberley might be something. But Mr. Darcy had in fact returned to Pemberley unexpectedly early. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. His behaviour was strikingly altered. He had never spoken with such gentleness. She knew not what to think, nor how to account for it. Why is he so altered, thought Elizabeth. From what can it proceed? Is it impossible that he should still love me? I know what's going to happen. I know, I'm turning the page. I am turning the page. It's all good. But her astonishment at Darcy's unaffected cordiality was rudely interrupted by a letter from Jane containing news of the most shocking kind. Elizabeth's sister Lydia had eloped with Wickham. You having a little wash there? A little wash to get ready for the end of the story. There is nothing but love, flirtation, and officers in Lydia's head. But she has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt Wickham to marry her. She is lost forever. I know. It's a bit worrying, isn't it? I know we can't come to more. Elizabeth returned to Longbourn immediately and waited for further news of her sister's predicament. Through her aunt she discovered that Mr. Darcy had hunted Wickham down in London and induced him to marry Lydia. Darcy also paid off Wickham's gambling debts and brought him a commission in a new regiment quartered in faraway Newcastle. Elizabeth was stunned to learn of the pains he had taken, but her heart did whisper that he had done it for her. A few weeks later, Darcy visited the Bennets at Longbourn with his friend Mr. Bingley, who finally proposed to Jane. Yay! Good gracious, cried Mrs. Bennet, if that disagreeable Mr. Darcy is not coming here again with our dear Bingley. It's all getting very exciting. Yeah. Elizabeth tried to thank him for his unexampled kindness to her poor sister. Though her family would remain ignorant of what he had done for them, they would be forever in his debt. Your family owe me nothing, Darcy said. Much as I respect them, I believe I only thought of you. They walked on without knowing in what direction, for there was too much to be thought and felt and said for any attention to other objects. Oh, look at them, Button. I know. This time Elizabeth accepted Fitzwilliam Darcy's proposal. I love him. And thus she was sat down where to write to her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. I am the happiest creature in the world. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world and that he can spare from me, and you are all to come to Pemberley at Christmas. Yours, Elizabeth Darcy. The end. Oh, it finished. It finished with a little Christmas tree. They were coming to Pemberley at Christmas. Did you enjoy that? Yes. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave us a comment below letting us know what you thought. As I said, those other videos will be linked in the description box because we read A Guinea Pig, Pride and Prejudice. Today we have read A Guinea Pig Nativity and A Guinea Pig Romeo and Juliet, and Button would like for you to watch them if you haven't already done so. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and make sure you're subscribed so that my next video lands in your subscription feed, and I will see you then. Bye.